Welcome to the Critical Practices Talks. This is our fourth conversation in a series of monthly talks with researchers and practitioners in the fields of art, curating, critical theory, and museum studies. These conversations explore mainly the capabilities of practice in the areas of art, design, curating, and museum studies to produce knowledge, advance critical inquiries, and finally intervene in society. Our previous conversation was with Sepake Angiama. Sepake is currently the artistic director at INIVA and was here with us talking about and learning together also curatorial practices based on a process of disruptive practices and how important those practices were for Sepake's work, but also in her new role at INIVA. Today, I invited Beatrice von Bismarck, who is here with us to talk a bit more about her current curatorial practice, but also her role as one of the directors of the MA of the curatorial practice, cultures of the curatorial at Leipzig. Beatrice von Bismarck is a professor of art history of the Academy of Fine Arts in Leipzig, where she also teaches visual cultures and cultures of the curatorial. In Leipzig, she founded the MA in Cultures of the Curatorial precisely in 2009. We will be talking a bit more about this particular program and this phrase. Before this role in Leipzig, von Bismarck has also worked in other cultural institutions and higher education institutions. She also co-convened and co-directed the itinerant Trans-Curatorial Academy that has been touring from Berlin to Mumbai and Phnom Penh between 2017 and 2018. This is when I had the pleasure to actually meet Beatrice as well. And in 2018, she was Philippe Jabra, visiting professor of art history and curating at the American University of Beirut. And for her research project on the curatorial, she was awarded the Opus Magnum Fellowship of the Volkswagen Stiftung, Hanover, between 2015 and 2017. Recent publications include, finally, Curatorial Things, co-edited with Benjamin Meyer Kramer, and this was published in 2019, so last year. Also, Of Our Times, Curatorial Anachronics, co-edited with Rick Frank, also published last year. And finally, The Curatorial Condition, which is about to come out probably not any longer in 2020, but eventually in the beginning of 2021. So looking forward. Beatrice, thank you so much for joining us and accepting the invitation.
Thank you for the invitation, Carolina.
Thank you so much. So I would like to start from the beginning, so to speak. Cultures of the Curatorial, a program that you initiated, as I said before, in 2009. So it's been more than 10 years now. But Cultures of the Curatorial is not only an MA program, I would say, is also a term that you coined that articulates the openness, I think, of curating to the curatorial, and to think of the curatorial as a more expanded practice that looks into the conditions, as you wrote, the conditions that are disciplinary, institutional, economic, political, and regional, under which art and culture become public. And so you've been working on this for now 11 years. I would like to invite you to travel in time, so to speak, to go back to 2009 and to explain what were the main reasons back then for the creation of a program like this. Why was it important for the field? What were the debates back then, or the urgencies, let's say, that made this program necessary?
Yeah, I think I like very much the way that you kind of historicize the program already. So that gives me a chance to state right at the beginning to say that we conceived the program as a context-sensitive program, as a program that develops according to the situation, according to the discourse, and that means in very pragmatic terms. For example, the fact that in the German-speaking countries, all through the 10s, there still wasn't any program that addressed curatorial practice at all. There was no curatorial studies program. And that only started really very slowly in Germany, particularly, and to 2009, suddenly 3 programs started. Ours was the first, and then there was one in Frankfurt and one co-joint Bielefeld and Düsseldorf, very different ones. But the idea of our program was right at the beginning to understand what I call the curatorial. I come back to that in a second, in terms of a practice that necessarily needs to intertwine theory and practice, or theoretical practice and practical theory, in a mode that enables a younger generation of curators or would-be curators to participate in the art field under the conditions of globalized cultural production on the one hand, and also a post-Fordist society on the other. And in that respect, cultures of the curatorial meant to imply right from the beginning 2 things. First, a field, the curatorial understood as a social field in which a variety of very different actors play a part and have to relate to one another in order to be able to define the relations amongst them. And secondly, an understanding of the curatorial as something that is defined continuously and in different cultural contexts, which might be defined regionally, which might be defined disciplinary, which might be defined according to gender, race, whatever the relevant contexts might be in which the curatorial becomes active. And that meant that it had a very strong understanding right from the beginning of the curatorial as being of societal relevance in the methodology and practices that it employs, as well as in the structure that it echoes in relation to society, but it can also kind of provide maybe effects, provide models in which you can have or produce impulses for the societal and surrounding. And some of the issues that are really at stake there are historically coined, in as much as they relate to, for example, the enormous demands on publicity as they have risen after the 1960s. And the curatorial, if you define it as I do, as a coming together in public, a being together in public, then has a lot to do with this moment of becoming public and being responsible for the way in which this moment is articulated, and how the connection with the public takes place. So the curatorial would relate very much to this new demand of publicity, which of course has changed drastically yet again with the digital media and the social media and everything that reaches from the very individual, personal mode of producing your own publicity, of producing your own image, to other forms of organizing a public, of allowing for public through the means of the curatorial. then I think it's a very specific labor that it's implied. And this labor relates very much to immaterial labor, as we have gotten to know it over the course of post-Buddhist society. However, because of its, and maybe I have to say this as a very strong point, because of its acceptance, the curatorial is accepted as a field of cultural production in its own right. So not only a service to culture, but also a very specific, culturally productive area or practice. Because of that, I think it also relates in a very specific way to this mode of immaterial labor and allows for different shifts, alterations, comments on the existing conditions under which that takes place while being embedded in it. And I think that is one of the characteristics of the curatorial field, that it reflects and forms at the same time. It and reflects and makes operational some of the conditions that it's embedded in, but also it reflects it in a critical mode and sets impulses. And maybe the third is the risen acknowledgement of the advantages of cooperative or collective forms of cultural, but maybe more general, of production in general in society. And the curatorial, because of its setup in terms of a variety of actors, or if you want, actants, not only people but things, allows for on a symbolic level, setup of very experimental, commenting again, criticizing modes of doing exactly that, of analyzing the way in which this assembly takes place, or I would call it the constellation, in which that configures itself, and how these relations within it then become operative and active, but does so in relation to itself, but also in relation to society. So, having said that, I think de-hierarchization is something that runs through the whole idea of educating within the curatorial field, meaning to be able to define tasks and roles and positions and statuses in a much more flexible way than it has been. Then we have been used to do, because in the 60s it was necessary to have a much more differentiated idea about professions, because the art field has risen it's expanded so much. But it also means to look much more at the practices at stake, and then make a decision of who's doing what, with whom, for what purpose, and with what techniques and strategies. And it means to understand it more process-oriented and relational, meaning that it's under constant reformulation as a field, but also in terms of the relations that it's set up by. And I think one thing that maybe I should emphasize in this context as well, it's about meaning production. If we consider the curatorial as a cultural production in its own right, then it's about meaning production, and the whole idea within the field of the curatorial is about the participation in that form of meaning production and the specificities that it allows for.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I was, as you were speaking, I was thinking of this. It seems to me that, especially when you use the term the curatorial, or probably whatever was there before the opening, from curating to the curatorial. So the curatorial is no longer this service provider. I think you said cultural service, and I think I would use that phrase just for the sake of the argument here. So it's thinking, I guess, that exhibition making, the practice of exhibitions, would be the final outcome of that curating practice, and that would be to display a series of, or to juxtapose works that would be thought according to a new narrative, according to a new proposition. But what happened to the way you are defining the curatorial, it seems to me, is that we are no longer necessarily locating the site of the curatorial in an exhibition making. We are no longer probably even situating the curatorial in the practice of a curator, and this is probably a provocation or just also kind of a question for you, but we are talking, as you were saying, we were talking about a constellation of actors, of things, of ideas, of conditions. So when we open the curatorial to that, which then happens in the making public of that constellation. So when we do that, what do we understand being the role of the curator as a professional, say, or a job title? As you mentioned, I think you touched upon, but I just wanted to hear a bit more about that, because ultimately I believe that some of the students that join your program, and here I'm probably speculating, but I would think that most of them are or want to become curators. So I wonder, how do you situate the professional practice of curatorship within the curatorial?
It's a very good question, because it cannot be answered with a single line. The program addresses people with very different backgrounds, meaning artists and art history and cultural studies, which are kind of to be expected in a way, but we also have students coming from, or participants from dance and theatre, but also from anthropology and sociology and philosophy. I think their interest really is in how does a cultural product become public, and that can be a very abstract product and a very concrete one or material one. But the question that they all pursue is, how does this coming together in public produce meaning that allows for, but is not only meant to, but allows for mediation, but does something else while, I mean, the mediation would be kind of addressed towards the audience, but the becoming public with the audience would imply that all the other elements come together too, and through their coming together produce something that I would call a new meaning. And so what the participants of the program would like to become can be curators in the more professionalized way for museums and exhibition spaces. But it can also be, and has happened, that they are much more interested in doing film programs and festivals, or they're interested in going into publishing, because that's something that we also have integrated as a culture of the curatorial in the program, that the book space or any print space is understood as a space in which something that one might call curatorial it can take place and can be understood as something that can take place there. And to understand that role that they're then in as one that has to be formed in processes of negotiation. And this negotiation is necessary for everybody in that situation, but has to take place in relation to whatever else is participating in the situation. But by that I mean that the idea of their role within the situation of the participant of the program, the role in the situation is one that's maybe not fixed right from the beginning, but starts with an awareness of what is at stake that can be negotiated. This can be very conflictual, and you do not have to negotiate if you don't want to, because you think you know your position, but it would mean that you then, no matter whatever you do, you will encounter conflictual situations with everybody else in the situation. So how do you do that? And I think the curatorial role is beyond this aspect of negotiation, to be aware of this constant potential that none of the roles, of the tasks, of the statuses and of the positions are clear. And even if you do not want to acknowledge it, even if you want to cover it up, or even if you want to neutralize it, I think it's a given thing. Curators have always done this or that. The idea of our program would be that you will never take any of that for granted anymore, but you enter any new situation with the option, with the potential of that negotiable relation among everybody involved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so going back to the cultures of the curatorial and thinking in terms of how these last 10 years kind of helped, I think, you also inform a new program, a new approach, but at the same time, how do you come to the 10th anniversary? What are your reflections now? We are in a different political and I would say cultural moment to the one we were back in 2009, not only within the debates of the curatorial, but in a more systemic, I would say, and geopolitical sense. I'm not talking only about the context, specific context in which we are talking, which is a potential lockdown where you are, definitely a lockdown where I am because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but thinking more in terms of what is 2020 or 2021, say, just around the corner, since we are in December now. So how are you actualizing the initial preoccupations that were there in the cultures of the curatorial for the next decade, I would say, to come?
I think the program can now rely on a very dense theoretical production that has taken place over the last 10 years already. I think the change between 2009 and 2019 is really immense, and because there were so many publications and so many projects that were dealing with the curatorial in a very self-reflexive, critical way, and putting up a new agenda, there's a whole, at least 2 generations already who deal with their own practice in a very different way, as far as the willingness to theorize also the practice, and to practice the theoretical outcome in a way. But I think what has changed, and that is probably true in the German context as well as in an international one. On the one hand, in Germany, curatorial practice has to be even more political than it has been before, because the institutions have to take a stance within the changing socio-political field. And in some areas in Germany, this is more obviously so, and maybe even more urgent, because there it is a matter of how do you actually address people in a way that communication can be kept up at all around cultural and social-cultural issues. So how does an institution structure itself and redefine its strategies in order to be able to do that? And I think that is very curatorial labor that has to be done there. It's about the role of archives. It's of course the question of museums. It's the question of small culturally, socially engaged institutions in that area. So what is the purpose of these institutions, and what are the strategic options that they have? And I think that is one of the aims that with that program we would really like to pursue. And so it's something that you're very familiar with. It's really institution as practice and as a critical practice through the curatorial. I think that is one thing. Then there's another thing that I think has changed. At the beginning of our program, it was really very important to relate to the globalization of the art field through an intensified exchange and networking globally, so that the different cultures in that respect and cultures of the curatorial could be exchanged and could be brought into a kind of productive exchange among those participating, but also kind of transported into the different areas of practice and enhance the mutual knowledge. At the moment, my feeling is that any such exchange should be much more specific in terms of the context in which you work. I think that is a long discussion. Context specificity is a long discussion. But I think you can do a lot of relevant work in local terms that has a translocal, international, maybe vibration outside of it, or relevance also outside of it, and can be brought back, so that the work is not so much related to travel anymore, but more to communicating something that has happened in very kind of closed and individual circumstances, and it is very particular work, so that you take the methodology as exemplary, and not necessarily the kind of spreading out all over where you kind of gather different forms of experience.
Mm-hmm. So this necessity, it seems to me from what you were describing, to after nurturing with some, I think, care and resources as well throughout the last 10 years of the program, a sort of a more global scale around curatorial production and critical tools, etc., around involving let's say in terms of the focus of the program being sort of more global in a way, one could argue. It seems like one of the aspects that you mentioned that for me is particularly interesting is how you now feel that there's a need to focus on a more localized regional approach, but also thinking of if I understand you right, the infrastructures that are already there, meaning institutions, that might be feeling the responsibility as well to be in touch with those institutions, with those infrastructures, to probably also negotiate, as you say, exchange create critical tools through the curatorial that can be also at the service, let's say, of those that are operating on the ground, that are actually developing, directing those particular institutions. And that's, for me, it's kind of a quite interesting shift, because I still remember the kind of quite romantic idea about self-organized projects and quite temporary and quite say also very responsive, but very resourceful as well, or without resources at all, as we know, or no budget projects, or on a shoestring, etc. So we know that there was a very prolific and interesting production led by not only curators, as we know, but also artists, developed micro temporary projects across, I think, the globe. But I think what you're saying is something that it feels to me quite pragmatic as well. Thinking, so, but what are the infrastructures that we have already here, and what are they doing? How can we work together, and probably ensure that the ambition is to establish dialogue more than creating like, as I said before, this kind of more scaled up global discourse and practices of the curatorial, but try to see how now they can enter a particular context that can be effective, that can be like dialogical, that can be negotiated, it seems, on a more kind of a focalized and more regional approach. Is it? Am I right to say this, or?
It's maybe not necessarily pragmatic. It takes into account what perhaps has been acquired as a knowledge of the cultural encounters in international terms, that it is really necessary to look very closely at the infrastructures and how they work, and how you want to alter them if you do want to alter them, or how you can use them if there is something that's usable. So it's about support structures, it's about social connections, it's about the very basic supply that institutions or that cultural work can take place in. But it's also really about the potentials and the possibilities this infrastructure actually allows for or doesn't allow for, and what you want it to allow for. Thinking it is that I currently do think that institutional practice, understood in the widest sense of the word, in terms of the infrastructure that it needs and relies on and might perhaps need in a different way, are terms that I'm really interested in as a slightly shifted framework.
Mm-hmm. So I think my next thought is on the educational capacity of the cultures of the curatorial. And what I mean is we as professionals, let's say in higher education, we know that there's probably, well, especially in this area, we know that the teaching component or the educational component in programs like this are quite different to others in other disciplines, in the sense that ultimately one of the key elements of programs like Cultures of the Curatorial is to develop individual critical tools to tackle one's own research and practice approach. How is that different? How do you think that the Cultures of the Curatorial is different to other teaching programs that probably follow in a more straightforward way a particular syllabus, a particular curriculum, and in the sense of programs like this one, how do we teach curating or the curatorial? How does that happen? Because you tend to use a very interesting phrase as well when you talk about education, which is learning with instead of learning about. And I wonder if there's something in this learning with that reflects the way you developed the MA program, or you established your own educational curriculum in the cultures of the curatorial. And how is that specific to that program? Because I think most of these ways of operating in the field, they are probably not transferable. They are very specific to the way we practice and the way we developed educational programs. But what do you think about this? What is your take? Do you think they are different? Maybe not. And if so, how are they different? And what is this learning with that you mentioned so eloquently?
There was a lot of discussion in the early 10s, I would say, that exhibitions, particularly in these curatorial programs, became incredibly refined and almost a bit maneuristic in the way that, you had the most extraordinary topics and themes and maybe the most extraordinary artistic positions and sites. But what we try to do is that these projects have an inner dynamic as well that allows for reflection, what I call negotiation, allow for reflection on the positions from where you speak and how you participate in the whole process, but also collectively to elaborate on a topic. There's one project that the participants do together, the first one, and there's a second one where they can choose whether they work together with somebody else or do it individually. So they run the whole process is one that very much emphasizes collective working processes within the curatorial, and the learning with there would be an idea of opening up to something that you think you might be interested in without perhaps knowing in advance what the outcome should be. So we would leave the format of the exhibition as a necessity. It could be a lot of other things too. It could be a book, could be a video, it could be an event, a talk, a panel, whatever. And the learning would take place in the relation of the participants amongst each other. Since they come from such different backgrounds, the learning starts right at the beginning to have a vocabulary at hand in which you can communicate, because you do not share that vocabulary at the beginning. But it continues with a learning with whatever the issues and the artists and the objects and the sites that they're dealing with. And in an art school, this is particularly interesting because since not everybody is doing that course at the same time, everybody else in the art school is not used to the negotiation processes at all. So you encounter, so it's real life, and neither are the cooperation partners that we have where we do some of the projects. We start them usually with the museums in the region, meaning the stately art collections in Dresden, as well as the contemporary gallery in Leipzig, as well as the House of World Culture, Haus der Kultur in der Welt in Berlin. So it's a constant process of readjusting yourself in relation to what you want to do and in relation to the partners and the other actors in that situation. And I think I defined it learning with rather than learning from because of the embeddedness. It is a mutual learning and can never be anything else. And for the participants in the program, this is a situation which perhaps in the program leaves them the most freedom before kind of re-entering into the practices, back into the practices that I had established before. It's a freedom, but it's a time of potentiality in a way, but it's always an embedded process in which they are responsible for their participation in the formation of the relations that they enter into, and that the whole constellation of the curatorial situation kind of then creates. Was that?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I think the one of the elements definitely that struck me is the necessity to be quite flexible, because each iteration of the program, because of the different participants, because of the different constellations, because of the different conditions it generates, necessarily the program kind of adapts and follows that specificity, that's idiosyncrasy in a way, and I think that's where a program that is based on understanding the value of its participants instead of teaching a particular curriculum that was pre-established, regardless of who is sitting in front of you. It's actually the value, the particularity of programs such as the one you're running, and so that kind of element of being quite performative and quite flexible, not only for the participants, but I believe also for yourself and Benjamin. I think the people involved in the teaching of the program might be also that learning with that you mentioned. So everyone is in a way in the process of unlearning and learning something else, just by the fact that it's exposed to different participants, but also different questions, urgencies, and projects that then are generated out of that particular constellation. So I would like to ask you one more question, and is in a way is definitely related, but probably a departure from the cultures of the curatorial, and trying to look at one of your latest publications. That the subtitle, say, a part of the title is Curatorial Anachronics, and in that publication, yourself and the co-editor, you are putting forward a quite interesting proposition where you are bringing two elements to the discussion. One is to observe histories of exhibitions, or history of exhibitions, better said. And on the other hand, proposing that that history overlaps or it's intertwined with the potentiality of exhibitions to make history. And so there's a take here, there's an argument that says that the exhibition making, exhibition practices have been also addressing historical narratives, historical events, historical milestones, let's say, and proposing through the juxtaposition of materials in an exhibition space, have been proposing different articulations around those very historical facts or events, etc. And this is something that I'm particularly interested in, but it strikes me as a quite powerful, say, methodology of inquiry for the curatorial. And I wanted you to just to tell us a bit more about probably just the framework of the publication and what you mean by this curatorial anachronics, what is happening in the exhibition space in terms of time because of this term anachronics.
The idea really was to try and look again at exhibition history, because exhibition history has become so important again over the last 10 years, I would say. But we wanted to look at how do they do it, rather than how can we reconstruct the elements of the exhibition, because that is one part that is very much in the foreground, to reconstruct an exhibition, to see what has been there in terms of the material and maybe also in terms of the concept. But how did they do it, the exhibition? And how can you comment on that exhibition through an exhibition? And through that, redefine the narrative that the exhibition has, the previous exhibition has produced, and through that redefinition, rewrite the history that has been not only written in the exhibition, but written by the writing of exhibition history. So it would be two historical levels that we liked to address, and we look particularly at artistic positions that dealt with exhibition history, but also at curatorial positions that took up exhibition history, but reformed, re-performed entirely. And the participation in the writing of history would be one that takes place in these moments of transposition, of a transposition in which a different coming together in public takes place and alters the meanings of those who were part of that original exhibition as actors and actants. And we used the word anachronics. It had a lot to do with the fact that any exhibition is characterized by different temporalities, not only by the ones that you have through media or materiality within the exhibition, but through their own, through the histories that come together within an exhibition. Each actor and actant brings its or her or his own history into the constellation. And these histories become active as part of the relations as well. So you're talking about the social life and the biography of things and people that become active parts within that spatio-temporal site. And through that, you have to do constantly with shifts through time and space. And I think this is the moment in which the exhibition, if we call it an exhibition, when this coming together in public allows for a historical rewriting in terms of its meaning production. And if you look at a variety of exhibitions, the methodology of rearranging and of transposing implies a potential of enormous criticality, with very refined small gestures. And that's what the whole volume is about. How do you do that so that there is a new proposition for an understanding of history?
It's incredible how I think also the publication indicates and proposes a different way of talking about previous exhibitions. So as you were talking, as you said, exhibitions, histories, how are we to talk about previous exhibitions? Is it through the title, list of artists, captions or details about each artwork or element that is on display, not necessarily only artworks, about probably some references from the curatorial text, about probably the biography of some of the artists, etc., and the venue? Or are we to move that kind of analysis, interpretation, understanding, into a completely different site, I think, that is more thinking of what are exhibitions doing beyond the list of artists, beyond the list of objects on display, beyond certain elements that I think became quite traditional for the discipline of exhibition histories to name and in a way scrutinized. And so I'm just thinking of, for instance, Sarah Pearce's text in the publication, where we see things speaking in a quite different way. And so it's not about those particular details, it's about some anecdotes, it's about sometimes peripheral elements, or zooming in particularities that don't necessarily give us the overview, because the overview would be also an attempt to kind of universalize the perspective or the reading, but that's not what the experience of an exhibition is, as we all know. And I think taking also taking here the possibility of having a more subjective, a more situated as well perspective, and talk about exhibitions through those premises, which I think the publication definitely leaves us with a quite interesting set of tools to delve into that in that particular way. And again, as you mentioned, the temporality, I think it's quite interesting, because I was also thinking in terms of what happens to the reception of exhibitions. We know exhibitions don't play on or don't work for us necessarily when we are in situ, looking at the objects and strolling around. Sometimes things work on us, I don't know, 5-10 years later, 5 minutes later, I don't know. But in fact, the temporality of those experiences incredibly expanded, and obviously, and I think up to a certain extent, unknown and unforeseeable. Beatrice, thank you so much for your, again, for accepting the invitation, but also for your very thought-provoking comments and I think rationales around the cultures of the curatorial, the ongoing program that you've been directing and informing for the last 11 years. It was very interesting to also see your plans for the coming future, and how a kind of a stronger relationship and dialogue between the local sphere and the global sphere of the curatorial is something that you will be looking into for the coming iterations. But definitely also what is specific about curatorial studies and how do we go about it, especially in the program you've been running in Leipzig. So thank you so much for your time again.